As the battle opened up at midnight and multiple movements and attacks were occurring throughout the entire battle space all at one time, as Russian and Chinese assets, including Russian air power in the form of their committed Su-34 squadron, which was a very powerful strike aircraft, which was heavily laden down with air-to-ground ordnances, as well as Russian artillery forces, also very powerful, consisting of their two S-19 MSTA 152mm self-propelled howitzers forming a single battalion of these systems, as well as also the other divisional artillery battalion of their 207th Motor Rifle Division, consisting of the BM-21 Grad rocket systems, which were 122mm and could shower massive areas at a single time with 122mm rocket strikes and leave total ruination and devastation in their wake, as could the two S-19 MSTA self-propelled guns. As all of these assets were exceedingly powerful that the Russians contributed to this battle, as well as also even their Iskander tactical ballistic missiles, also from within their armies, 2nd Combined Arms Army operating south of this battle space in a different battle space in San Antonio, firing at Fort Hood and other far afield targets, including also closer in targets as well, which included Camp Maybury for one and other areas in this battle. The Chinese missile forces in Mexico, and although there was the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade 40 miles to the east of this battle space, which was a 20 by 20 mile battle space, which encompassed most of the Austin metro area, although not exactly all of it, but most of it, they would be firing at further afield targets. And the forces in Mexico of the 612th and 613th were bolstered by additional called-up battalions and were now reinforced brigades, as these forces would actually fire the exceedingly mass-produced systems like DH-10A long-range subsonic cruise missiles, which were very accurate and also very destructive, and also older tactical ballistic missile systems that were earmarked specifically for their use and had been stored away in long-term storage yet maintained over all the years so that they could fire them and increase the volume of firepower at any given moment, along with the newer and more capable Chinese missile systems that the active duty strategic missile forces battalions that comprised their brigades utilized, like their hypersonic weapons, as well as newer tactical ballistic and cruise missile systems as well, which were also enormously mass-produced for this invasion, and they would not at all run out of missiles of any type, especially in the cruise missile category, as China's freakish ability to mass-produce thousands of cruise missiles in a single week was, to say the least, massively impressive. They could also produce a large amount of tactical ballistic missiles, although nowhere near as many as they could the cruise missiles, but nonetheless, they would not run out of ammunition. And all of this firepower being directed at multiple targets throughout the country was simply saturating everything between the air, missile, and artillery fires from multiple different types of platforms, whether from ground, air, or even sea-based weapons. And besides Camp Maybury, which would be left a smoldering crater that even as a Russian combat engineer battalion would enter the area would find nothing remaining, not even rubble after all the multiple systems that would strike it. From the air and artillery systems to also the tactical ballistic and cruise missiles that would all hit the same area. As again, it was not at all uncommon sometimes for multiple different systems to hit the same target in this invasion, which would create such a level of devastation that, again, there would be absolutely nothing left remaining of the facilities. And as the Chinese began dangerously near most of their objectives, as did even the Russians for that matter, one People's Armed Police Battalion that originated within the city of Round Rock, one of the northern suburbs of Austin, besides Pflugerville and even Georgetown further off the map, adjacent to which most of the rest of the 297th Air Defense Artillery Brigade of the 2nd Combined Arms Army was stationed on their CCP regime properties to the west of Georgetown. These forces would overrun immediately the headquarters of the 1st of the 355th, a Reserve Battalion of the Army Reserve component, it was a training battalion comprised mostly of drill sergeants and other types of training cadre. And because of America's shortfalls meeting recruiting goals and their need to slash entire job classes out of the American Armed Forces, this was even going on during the Great Eastern European Proxy War, as recruiting quotas could absolutely not be met due to all the disastrous policies undertaken by the American regime at the central government level, as well as also its military forces adhering to these policies, which were utterly disastrous for the American Armed Forces and made the military shrink instead of grow, or even for that matter, stay at stable levels. And as a result, Reserve and National Guard forces called up, including even ancillary types of forces, which were typically supporting elements and not combat elements, including even training type forces, had to be given heavier weapons in order for them to be used as security elements across the nation. As America was a vast nation, and the size of America's armed forces made it spread exceedingly thin and in very small numbers, whereas the amount of forces China alone deployed, which was 10 million to this entire invasion of active military, their ready reserve, military, regular reserves, and of course their freakishly massive paramilitary forces, as they had many millions under arms, they sent 10 million out of their entire forces, which were marginally and massively larger than this number. And with the Russians, 2 million contributed as their military grew during the Great Eastern European Proxy War. They too were able to afford to send 2 million to this invasion. And these forces alone, not even adding all the allies, which were all regional powers that contributed smaller forces, was simply far too much, and they always outnumbered the American military forces in each and every battlefield. And as a result of this, and beginning dangerously near their objectives, the lightning strike to the jugular was total, and it was absolute. And the destruction and barbarism was phenomenal, as these PAP forces, beginning dangerously again near the headquarters of the 1st of the 355th, all at the same time as Camp Mabry was being destroyed by missiles, air, and artillery systems, and the bivouac site of the 2nd of the 198th, minus its Alpha Company, which again was deployed in New Mexico for training at the time the invasion's kickoff, was also being hit heavily by People's Armed Police artillery and also the Russian air power deployed against them, just as the Russian artillery was hitting Camp Mabry and leaving it in total ruins. And Chinese artillery forces in Pflugerville would, again, be striking and destroying, with the Chinese missile forces firing some of their DH-10A long-range cruise missiles from Mexico, the American headquarters of their forces present. As we go to the map, to the north of the headquarters compound of the 1st of the 355th was a grouping of over 200 armed reactionary civilians that had effectively come out of their homes and moved into an area near the American headquarters establishment, as the 1st of the 355th's headquarters was seen as somewhere where the armed civilians should try to make contact with the military forces, as all the communications were gone due to the anti-SAT cyber strikes and electronic warfare meddling. And as a result of this, as the PAP rolled in sheer speed and force with one battalion, as they had multiple different combat companies, totaling 7 combat companies plus their support and command elements in their headquarters and support company, which was off map, along with also the headquarters platoons of each of these 2 companies, as the other 5 companies were surrounding the American armed reactionary civilians in the north, leaving these 2 companies in the south to both deal with the American company of their headquarters of the 1st of the 355th Battalion, still on their headquarters campus, as well as also the southern end, or southern wing, of where the armed reactionary civilians were present. As this pair of Chinese fighter aircraft passed overhead from the PLAAF from their JF-17Bs, their state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry fighters, they wouldn't even be used in any type of capacity in terms of close air support, as they weren't even needed. As again, the Chinese also had combat drones operating in this battlefield, as they did in many other battlefield sectors where they, or even in some cases, their allies were employed, and would use a Wing-Loong 2 for close air support in this battle, in conjunction with loitering munitions having had been fired by their headquarters battalion's dedicated drone section with their TEL-like system with 48 tubes capable of firing 48 at a time, and they would keep loitering munitions airborne at all times, as they had different warhead options from HE, which was high explosive, to Heat, which was high explosive anti-tank, and Fragmentation, which produced maximum shrapnel effect and could even destroy light-skinned vehicles like civilian and even light-skinned military vehicles. These would be equipped with HE munitions in this area, and most would be used against the armed reactionary civilians to the north and off this map, as the 5 other combat companies of the battalion were busy with dealing with them. And one of the combat company's combat elements of 3 combat platoons moved down this street and effectively cut off any means of connectability between the Americans on their compound, their headquarters compound, and those to the north, as this was the southernmost end of the armed reactionary civilians located north of this battle space. And these buildings were in the process of being cleared, as these were offices and warehouses and other businesses that this headquarters was located within. It had a wall, a short concrete abutment with plants and other types of decoration within it that surrounded the fence line of the entire installation. These were gatehouses on these streets here that surrounded the area. This gatehouse had been annihilated by a tactical ballistic missile strike from a DH-10A Chinese cruise missile, and 2 more were inbound at the same time as this artillery was inbound and destroyed these parked vehicles in this motor pool right here in this parking area. As this building was horribly gutted, it was about to be hit and finally finished off by one of these 2 cruise missiles, while the other would hit right here, as well as the artillery at nearly the same time, and destroy these American vehicles and troops leaving this building of the headquarters company. As there would be 50 left in this building, 20 in this building, and 10 left in this building, with others that were trying to escape, approximately numbering 30 here. They would all be destroyed, just as these guarding the gatehouse and these trying to come out of this building would be as well. As the People's Armed Police combat forces in this area were not only being supported by massed artillery fires from 2 batteries from their battalion on CCP properties in Pflugerville, as 2 firing batteries out of the 7 firing batteries in the headquarters and support battery or company, effectively, of the battalion, were firing 2 batteries here and the rest down here at the time. These forces, concentrating their 16 total 130mm howitzers, created immense destruction on the American headquarters facility. All of it ISR guided and directed, as always, as all the strike packages that come down to the FDCs and other forces, whether air or other types, was all AI processed for maximum effectiveness and accuracy, as these Chinese forces stormed into the area around the installation and would cut American troops down quickly and with a measure of barbarism included, such as even getting to the point where they would use bayonets instead of just simply finishing off enemy forces with a round. They would get up close and personal and do horrifying things with blades, as that was some of their trademark activity. As they were supported by loitering munitions and their combat Wing-Loong 2 drone in the area, firing CM-502KGs, which were a far overpowered type of missile for what they were using it against, these armed reactionary civilian elements. Their heavy machine gunners on their turrets, their W-85 heavy machine gun turrets on their APC versions of the WZ-551s were firing their 12.7mm fire, and their IFVs would be firing their upgunned 30mm fire, as WZ-551 IFVs either had the 25mm original autocannon or they were upgunned to a 30 typically. And as these forces would cut off American civilians, again, from making contact with military forces or even vice versa, this platoon's elements would move to the south, clearing warehouses and offices and other buildings, while one platoon would go straight for the jugular, this building itself. As these double column rolling shields behind and on the side of their vehicle would deploy from either side of the vehicle, out from behind or from the side of it, to watch the outside of this area as their other forces first had eradicated these forces with a combination of small arms fire, 35 millimeter barrel-fired grenades, which were lobbed behind these forces to cut them up effectively, as well as vehicle-based fires, which were heavy and destroyed these gatehouses entirely as they fired their HE armor-piercing ammunition and cut down the forces right behind it. As these moved right up on top of the abutment and smashed through the flimsy chain link fencing and broke their way in. They then rolled into this area while two other squads, which were these two that had cleared this office building, emerged and moved alongside of them and fired at these forces as they went through and breached as well and cut them down in L-vectored fire tactically, while these two squads, which at first started pouring fire on them from the front, had then, in effect, moved around and began to bound and cover tactically and laying down fire on these forces from outside as two squads, again, these two that went and cleared this office, had gone in to fight these 20 inside of this building along with this single squad in a rolling T that was taking the outside between these buildings as per SOP when building clearing, whether vehicles, troops, or both stayed outside. They then moved and went in and breached as well from this side as they got their way in through the flimsy fencing, and it was already smashed open anyway by the vehicles. As these vehicles destroyed the gatehouse and also made another way in if it was needed, they pulled around and went down the street alongside of their troops who were right aside of them to the point to where they could fire their weapons safely over their head. Again, angle and traverse was very important for the vehicle-based fires. And as a result of that, these two squads that took position outside of this building at the very opening before this squad that had cleared this large warehouse emerged, these CH-901As destroyed this technical and these armed reactionary civilians in the south. Again, these missiles had long since hit and destroyed the rest of this building that was horribly dilapidated and about to be destroyed anyway from all the artillery fire gutting them. And these cruise missile strikes finished everything off in this area, along with the concentrated artillery fire, which destroyed these buildings and everything else in this area as well, like a building right here. And these forces were trying to effectively flee, but they would be cut down by fires from this company moving up into this area that would deploy their first platoon in two directions to take this direction and this direction at the same time, while three squads would go in and clear this building as a loitering munition had at the opening destroyed this armed reactionary civilian technical. CM502 KGs and vehicle-based 12.7 millimeter fires annihilated these armed reactionary civilian technicals. This squad would stay outside as per building clearance SOP and move up alongside of their troops going in to clear this next building that had armed reactionary civilians inside. There were 10 of them. And these two squads, which were 10 each, easily finished off these forces with no wounded, no casualties, and then they moved to clear these buildings. These loitering munitions went further north to hit other targets at the time. This force went around as these squads were clearing this building, this office here, of these armed reactionary civilians before moving and taking final position right here as these forces moved to clear this building as they were watching the outside of this building, taking their sector of fire, much like what was being done here as these forces, some of them would actually make it in, but most would be cut down by the fires, as mentioned before, the fires coming down against them as they tried to flee these areas. While all of that was going on, as again, many different actions are occurring at the same time. This is an example of just how quick certain installations were overrun and destroyed, as the People's Armed Police shock forces showed no mercy in this urban combat. And when going through buildings, whether offices or otherwise, like warehouses, they moved through as tactical teams, supporting one another, each taking a sector of fire and carrying even devastating weapons that the armed reactionary civilians simply could not withstand. They couldn't withstand hand grenades, 35mm barrel-fired grenades from beneath the QBZ-95s of men that carried those. They couldn't withstand rocket-propelled grenades. They couldn't withstand HJ-08 anti-tank missiles if those were even needed or deployed. They could not withstand these weapons, or especially flamethrowers as well, when deployed. They were not always deployed, but when they were absolutely devastating on buildings and personnel, and even certain vehicle types. The Type 74s were a nasty flamethrower, nasty weapon. It was a terror weapon and absolutely devastating on enemy targets. Outside of buildings, naturally, the loitering munitions support received from CH-901A loitering munitions crashing down atop of enemy targets, as well as also the weapons wielded by their own squads. Again, heavy weapons like rocket-propelled grenades, Type 69 Chinese RPGs, HJ-08 Chinese anti-tank missiles, 35mm tube-fired grenades of troops that had them. This soldier right here would have had one beneath his QBZ-95. Light machine gun QBJ-201 with an exceedingly high rate of fire, spitting out 5.8 by 42mm ammunition, cutting these forces charging from the rubble piles as these forces sat higher up in these destroyed former buildings, trying to fire from their positions in the rubble, supporting these forces trying to attack head-on these PAP troops behind this brick wall in front of an urban building. This is a hit from another loitering munition. RPG had been fired from another squad member. This is most of the squad right here, including a rifle from the 10th man down here, as there was another man just off the map firing his RPG from this squad right here. It was a 10-man squad. This truck right here with the wheel, the axle, the muffler, the pieces of engine and twisted metal flying everywhere, that was hit by an HE-laden CH-901A loitering munition. 5.8 rounds are smacking into the engine block and through the windshield and cutting these people up as there's a man trying to fire his rifle, one-handed out the window, while an RPG had been fired at him at the same time as this man's getting ready to fire an AT missile into this rubble over here. There's an artillery shell crater back here. Total devastation. Total. The urban combat, again, was brutal, savage, full of barbarism, brutality of the worst kind. This was high-intensity warfare. This was not a game. This was not the low-intensity warfare that many Americans were accustomed to thinking that war was. This was very much more intense in every way, shape, or form. The air power, the artillery firepower, missile firepower, loitering munition firepower, maneuver unit firepower brought to bear was simply unfathomable. Even the sea-based weapons platforms, in addition to the air and ground-based firepower, was immense. This was the largest ever invasion in all of human history, topping what Operation Barbarossa even was during World War II. And until this invasion had kicked off, that had been still the largest ever invasion in human history, with 4 million German and Axis troops crossing into the Soviet Union, with the numbers of ground forces 3 times larger in this endeavor, with vastly more firepower, and even the air armada and sea armadas were bigger than what was used in Barbarossa. The sea armada by a large margin. As these forces now were in the process of overrunning this installation, or this headquarters compound rather, which effectively was a installation of sorts, these squads that had gone in, 3 total, to clear this building of 20 personnel, were now, with the support of their vehicles and other squads outside, they had cut these forces down with assistance from these squads before they had moved out of the building, because they were firing from inside the windows after they had taken this building. Cutting these forces down, also receiving help by this time from these 2 squads, bounding and covering tactically, as well as vehicle-based fires as these vehicles moved ahead. And by the time they got there and this action was taking place, they had cut these forces down. And then they proceeded on. Where they got here, they were fired at briefly by forces getting here, but it did not last very long. And I had to show the green to indicate that they had at some point taken fire, but it was very brief and it was over with quick. This loitering munitions strike had come in and hit some of these personnel right here. The vehicle-based fires into this up-armored Humvee from the lead vehicle being an IFV version of the Chinese WZ-551 fired its 30mm armor-piercing HE ammunition, which annihilated this Humvee, destroying it, shredding it, along with its armor kit put on it, into multiple pieces, along with the personnel inside of it. They attempted to fire a quick burst of 50 cal fire, but again, this vehicle could withstand 50 cal fire on the front and sides especially, but even a bit in the back. Although on the top of it, it was a bit different. The 50 cal fire could rip through the top armor of the WZ-551, but it was a fast, nimble, and very well armored wheeled vehicle that used RHA steel armor that could withstand virtually all small arms and definitely 50 cal based calibers, which are anti-materiel, and could go through some armor, but some that could not. It was much stronger than the American aluminum alloy armor that equipped the M113s, and as a result, the steel armor was far superior and in terms of protection afforded to the People's Armed Police forces. And as a result, these forces were cut down by these squads who bounded and covered continually and continued to finish them off, as this had finished some of these forces, but not all of them, and they had finished up their maneuvering, stopping in this position. The People's Armed Police, in this brief exchange of fire, would have a few wounded but no KIAs, as the troops that were hit would mostly be hit in the body armor, which would give some of them sore ribs, and basically a few were hit in the extremities, but they would be taken care of quickly by the combat medical forces of the coalition. As the vehicles made their final move here again and briefly exchanged fire with a few running into this warehouse up the street, as again they turned and fired down here. These forces had all been cut down by then when these forces were back here. These forces vectored fire this way. Some of the follow-up vehicles did as well, but the lead vehicle cut these forces down before they then assisted in this endeavor as well, as also did these squads bounding and covering up this way as well, parallel to their vehicles, offering mutual support, although this squad that had been outside of this building went in to assist this squad here in the clearance thereof, while this squad not only was moving parallel tactically to their vehicles to give mutual support, but also according to building clearance SOP, yet again, moving up alongside of the forces clearing the building and their vehicles. And as they moved up and cleared this large warehouse building, bounding and covering together tactically, this squad would stay outside while this squad would clear in this building alone. And then this squad would break into two half squads and cross the street tactically before reforming into a squad and clearing this large office. As, again, they would face this way upon coming out, half squad or 5 troops, while the other would come over, take up their position, face this side, and then the rest would come and cross, form a squad, and go in and clear this area tactically, before they then bounded across the way as well. This other additional squad that went in here and now was staying outside, while this squad right here in the wedge formation would continue to bound alongside of the vehicles while these squads would stay here. These were all the different tactical maneuvering that they were doing at this time, and they were doing it all exceedingly fast with combat drone support. If they needed it, they had air superiority at this point in this battlefield, because the fighter aircraft and all the air defenses of the coalition were ensuring that air superiority was not only obtained but held, and again, if needed, the Chinese JF-17Bs could, in an emergency, drop air-to-ground precision munitions or even free-fall munitions, precision being Baidu or satellite-guided or also laser-guided, but they could also drop free-fall munitions like napalm canisters and other weapons as well, if needed, for those aircraft that carried such. They also had their artillery forces on standby for support as well, not only that, but other coalition members, including Russia, could support them with artillery because they were present in this battlefield as well. And just like the Chinese supported Russian forces in this battlefield. The Su-34s, however, would provide the lion's share of close air support in this battlefield in terms of the air power, apart from the small-scale close air support provided by the combat drones like the Winglong 2s of China, which were more oriented towards precision strikes against limited and small targets, with their either HJ-10 long-range anti-tank missiles or their CM-502KG dual-purpose anti-ship and anti-armor weapons. The CM-502KG had a penetration ability that was strong enough to penetrate battleship armor, hence the reason why it was a dual-purpose missile in this regard. Very powerful. In the north, when these two squads eradicated these American armed reactionary civilians with their rocket-propelled grenade fires and also their small arms fires, they then bounded and covered tactically upon reaching across the street in short bounds while their platoon vehicles went to the side of the building, staying on the corner of the building. As this squad would stay outside as per SOP for building clearance, they fired at destroying this technical here while these forces went around and got cut down by the vehicle-based fire. Yet another tactical reason why vehicles or personnel stay outside while others clear buildings. As they went through this office building, after these forces were annihilated, the technical and these dismounts, these other two squads were bounding and covering tactically alongside of their vehicles to give mutual support, as well as their own platoon vehicles to give them mutual support as well, as each squad could effectively, or both even, assist each group of vehicles as needed. As their vehicles then moved up again, as did this squad here from this platoon, the other squad went in and began to fight all these forces in this building, along with this double column rolling shield peeling off and going inside the building from this direction. So the 20 different PAP shock forces of two different squads, while this squad waited outside and was on standby if needed, as were the vehicles in these other two squads if needed, at the time this building was being cleared, that is, these two squads of 20 troops went through and eradicated these 54 American armed reactionary civilians without any trouble whatsoever at all. They had far superior tactical training and heavier weapons, and they eradicated these armed reactionary civilians and had one wounded man that took a round in the shoulder from one of the armed reactionary civilians. As again, these squads broke up into tactical teams that cleared the building with a high rate of speed, a high rate of gusto, a high rate of gung-ho fanaticism and speed and power, using their tactical superiority and knowledge as well as their heavier weapons to great effect, and annihilated these armed reactionary civilians, while these two bounding and covering squads with their vehicles on either side at this point moved in, and this squad moved alongside of this warehouse while they went in to clear this building. But first, the vehicles had cut these forces down as they had went around. They were effectively shocked by what happened by the drone-fired missiles coming from the Winglong 2 combat drone, and this scared them around the corner as these vehicles just simply shredded them up. As they had, after these vehicles were blasted, they had sat here for a minute trying to figure out what to do before they went around and were cut up. When this squad went in, this one stayed outside. These forces, having had cleared this building, would hold their positions, with this squad holding its position, as now this installation was in the process of being finished off, as these three squads went in to clear these 50 American forces that remained inside of this building. And although they had fired out at these vehicles, at least initially, once these squads went in who took fire upon breaching, they would lose 2 of their troops in this battle against these 50 American troops. And they would lose several more wounded as well. But they would eradicate these command elements of the headquarters forces, as that's essentially who was in here, was the Lieutenant Colonel in command of this training battalion, the 1st of the 355th, and his staff, including his battalion XO, who was a major, and the Colonel and XO were captured alive with the rest of the staff being liquidated. Before that happened, these forces would send them out here before they cleared this last building together. One squad would take the outside, and these two squads would clear the last 10 troops in this building right here, which they did with ease, although they took some fire. Effectively, it did nothing to these forces. They lost troops in here, they lost a few troops in here, but they would not lose any more by the time they captured this building. Effectively ending rapidly in 40 minutes' time this entire exchange, as these forces of these two squads basically crossed, again, 5-man teams crossing tactically, before they went and cleared this building with this squad here, and they left a squad out here to watch this flank while they crossed to clear this building here, as again, some had made it in alive. And the PAP troops, as they breached, they took some fire, but they cut down the very small handful of remaining forces. As these squads were watching each side, they watched this ruined headquarters building while they watched up the street with their vehicles, who made one final move to this area right here. Essentially, the lead IFV just rolled up a little bit, leaving the rest of the column of their combat forces behind them. Effectively, this operation of rapidly and tactically clearing buildings was conducted with a very high degree of success. Again, this was very early in the invasion. These shock forces had complete total surprise, ISR dominance, firepower dominance. The speed with which they ran through these buildings was stunning to the defending forces. And yes, they took some wounded, most minor, and they lost a few of their soldiers, but two companies had effectively crushed the American command elements of one company, their headquarters company, within their own headquarters, with heavy artillery support, because the artillery rained down shells on the compound, eradicating it, along with missile strikes from DH-10A cruise missiles that were fired. Chinese had loitering munitions support. Even a combat drone, one of 10 deployed to the Austin battle space, of their Wing-Loong 2s, firing 4 of its 12 weapons aboard, its CM502KG dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-armor weapons. All of it ISR directed from the quadcopter level all the way to the high altitude level, like this Russian 4-post recon drone, the Chinese armed CH-4A high altitude recon drone, which by the way carries 4 additional weapons than even the dedicated Wing-Loong 2 combat drone can carry, interestingly enough, and the high altitude WZ-7 reconnaissance drone, unarmed. The satellites that overlaid with the high-altitude drones and the low-altitude assets made a real-time, fluid-moving image of the modern fluid battlefield that made weapons far faster to use and more accurate than was ever before possible, made the forces more flexible than was ever before possible. They went into this seeing everywhere where the Americans were. They knew where they all were. That's why they had very little trouble dealing with them. From the armed civilians, including here, to the military personnel, which even included a very scant few that made it in here and dodged the interlocking fields of fire from this platoon, from this combat company with its headquarters elements off-map, along with the headquarters elements of this combat company off-map. Again, they're in star formations where their strongest vehicles, being their MRAPs, were basically surrounding the command and logistical vehicles of their headquarters platoons. And the headquarters and support company over this entire People's Armed Police Battalion is effectively sitting back and away from the combat as well. And they're perfectly fine because they too, with their quadcopter assets, can see everywhere where Americans are and where they're not. and they can also direct fire right down upon them if they absolutely need to, which should even include their air power or also that of their allies. Again, making any attempt to attack these forces brazenly simply foolish in the eyes of the coalition forces, as they had a wide array of firepower that was highly accurate and could be delivered on any point of resistance in the modern fluid battlefield, because anything that could be seen can be destroyed, and they could see everything. This is real war. This is modern war. This technology is absolutely real, and China and Russia absolutely possess it. In the Great Eastern European proxy conflict, was even a small taste of the use of these weapons. And they'd even been restricted in their use. But now they were not. They were used full bore on the American nation, its regime, and its people, with no qualms about piles of casualties. In fact, these PAP forces would revel in it, as they would create massive piles of military KIAs and, of course, civilian KIAs. Next, in this battle, as it was unfolding, as it was just really getting started, was the fighting that occurred in the first hour of the battle in Lago Vista as well. As the Russians, every bit as much as the Chinese forces, were on the move throughout the entire battle space. Lago Vista was a very wealthy suburb, much like many of the outer Austin suburbs even were. And it was the home to many tech companies of America who had relocated here from Silicon Valley, where were upstarts. And although China was the world leader in virtually all technology at this point, the Russians, not very far behind them, agreed with the Chinese that they wanted to salt the earth, much like had been done to Carthage. And they agreed to destroy America's high technology sector so that it could never rise again, as America would be a Chinese colony. And all of their achievements, whatever they had achieved, would be obliterated in this conflict. So Austin was a political center, even a military production center in some regards, as it had different defense companies like Waco that had presence in this city. Although America's defense industry was actually quite small, despite the dollar amounts that were spent on equipment, they got very little for their money, and this was a proven fact. It was essentially high-priced equipment that was produced in too few numbers to make a difference, as America had effectively torn apart its own defense industries over the years. Since the end of the Cold War, they had forgotten how to mass produce weapons in large and sufficient quantity. They had one tank factory in Lima, Ohio. China and even Russia had a handful of tank factories, for instance. Not to mention all the missile factories, all the armored vehicle factories, for even different types of vehicles, as Norinco, one of many Chinese subsidiaries alone, had 300 mammoth factory compounds that were all 1.5 million square feet or larger, not to mention medium and small scale operations as well, in the multiple dozens. That was just Norinco. China South Industries Group had another 200. There's also the aviation and shipyard and other subsidiaries of China that had large production facilities in large numbers. Russia, too, had a large surge capacity. They weren't Chinese size, but they were big. Bigger than America, as the Eastern European proxy conflict had shown. And similar to the imagery as pictured here, although minus the Bradleys, the American troops in their own headquarters areas were being destroyed by cruise missile strikes, although these here would have been larger because the DH-10As were massive. They were large, long, destructive cruise missiles, long range. And of course, artillery fires as well, coming in and smashing whole areas to total piles of rubble or large artillery shell craters, as well as missile craters that left nothing at all remaining. Not to mention the airdropped ordnance and what it could do was simply devastating. The battle over Lago Vista will be next, as Russian forces of a mechanized infantry battalion sought to capture rapidly and intact the Rusty Allen Regional Municipal Airport here. And, of course, their combat engineers were already laying their PMP pontoon bridge over the Colorado, spanning the Lakeway area here, a suburb leading into the area near Leander and other suburbs, Round Rock, North Austin, as the armed reactionary civilians were already being pelted and basically showered by artillery from the BM-21 Grad systems, rained down total annihilation on top of them. And the Russian forces that would be sent in to basically conduct a BDA, or battle damage assessment, would be effectively all they would be doing, because there was almost never anybody left after these saturations of artillery. However, Lago Vista would be different, as there would be survivors that would try to put up the best fight they could. There were even American paramilitary forces in Lago Vista, interestingly enough, because they had been sent there due to the tech companies being seen as vital to national security. And Lago Vista might have even been one of the places where at least one of the companies from the second of the 198th rather would have been sent to defend critical infrastructure as well. More to come in the next video of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines using real-world everything.